everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor of Lincoln Square. And every week I talk with journalists from around the country to get their perspectives on politics and the media. So joining me today is my friend, John Micek. He's the political editor of MassLive.com in Boston. And previously, he was the editor at the Pennsylvania Capital Star and the opinion editor at PennLive.com. He also has written a book, Ordinary Angels, and he writes the Essential Substack, which you should definitely subscribe to. So, welcome, John.
Hi, how's it going, everybody? Good morning. Good to see you, Susan.
Good to see you too. So you have a lot going on, especially recently around the Boston area. Over the weekend, ICE arrested Marcelo Gomes Da Silva, who's a high school student in Milford. So that's the town southeast of Boston. And he was on his way to volleyball practice. I understand that he's a musician, an excellent student, but he was born in Brazil, has been in Milford since he was 6. And he was not the target of the ICE operation that's led to, about 1,500 people being arrested. But he was arrested anyway when they found out that he wasn't a citizen. So, John, what kind of impact has that arrest had on that community? And, how has it resonated across the state?
Sure. I mean, as you said, Susan, this is one of 1,500 ICE arrests since the start of the second Trump administration. They've really made their presence felt here on the ground in Massachusetts. We saw a really controversial ICE detention in the city of Worcester a few weeks ago. There's, of course, the national headlines with Reza Ozturk, the Turkish grad student who was arrested on the streets of Somerville, Tufts University, and held and litigated her detention. This is something that's really struck at the heart of this community. As you said, this young man came to the United States as a child. He was like 7 or 8 years old, on a student visa that had since expired, so he is undocumented. Um, ICE agents were after his father at the time. He was driving his dad's car on his way to volleyball practice. I said, "Hey, we can't get the dad fine. He's just as good because he's undocumented." So he's in detention in Burlington, Vermont, I believe. We had reporters on the ground there in Milford last night. There was a volleyball game against another local high school rival, who nonetheless showed great solidarity. With their crosstown competitors wearing T-shirts in support of him, students turning out, and, wielding signs, "Free Marcelo, let Marcelo go," that kind of thing. This again really struck at the heart of this community. Governor Moore Healey, Democratic governor, who actually started sort of the beginning of the tenure of the Trump administration, trying to strike a more conciliatory tone, has really become vocally critical, particularly in the prosecution of these ICE detentions. More often than not, the state officials are left in the dark about this kind of thing. And I mean, she literally said, like with one ICE arrest, that she had woken up to the news that morning just like the rest of us had, and was trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And this is the governor of the Commonwealth, who presumably would be in the loop about these kinds of things, and
Right.
demanding information out of ICE. ICE saying, well, this arrest was completely in bounds because the kid was undocumented. Um, you can litigate that, I suppose. But I mean, this is again something that's really struck at the heart of this community.
Right. And, a lot of people who voted for Trump, have said, we just thought he was going to get rid of the worst, all the criminals, the gang members. But, when you have a arrestive and, an honor student in high school and, moms are being thrown to the ground, it definitely seems like some people are having some sort of buyer's remorse about, supporting Trump last time around. Is that something that, you're seeing? I know you're in a safe blue state, but, are, are, are are some of the people who did vote for Trump last time around, expressing some regrets over it?
I mean, we have seen some of that in the polling data, Susan, where people are expressing reservations about sort of the very heavy-handed tactics that ICE is employing. The president's approval numbers, as you might expect in a heavily blue state like this one, are not the greatest. Democrats and independents, and that's probably the telling thing, is the support among independents has been pretty soft, and unenrolled voters, contrary to public opinion or public belief, rather, actually make up a pretty substantial number of the voter rolls here, and in fact, outnumber registered Democrats in
Mhm.
Massachusetts now. So there's somebody who can really make their presence felt in 2026 and 2028 and beyond. So the president's numbers have suffered here. Obviously, his support remains strongest among Massachusetts Republicans. Massachusetts Democrats, of course, take a very dim view of the current administration. But yeah, I mean, we have seen some of his numbers soften on his approvals. He was underwater in the most recent round of polling, and he has taken a ding on immigration as well. But again, among his partisans, registered Republicans and Trump identifying Republicans, he is sort of unshaken.
Yeah. Yeah, I do want to talk a little bit about the midterms. And I know you recently wrote about them in your column, Math is Hard, Midterm Math is Harder, the lessons that Massachusetts needs to learn for 2026. And so, even though Massachusetts is a Democratic stronghold, Trump did improve his margin there in 2024, like he did in many blue areas. Um, do you see that this is a pattern where he is starting to lose support beyond just in states like Massachusetts, but maybe more in swing states like Pennsylvania, where you were for many years, Michigan, where I am, those really crucial states that Democrats are going to have to win.
Yeah, I mean, what was really intriguing is, 'cause I moved to Massachusetts 2 years ago for this job and presumed, like everybody else did, that this was a blue wall state, and to a large extent, it still is. Vice President Harris won here handily last November. But what's really been interesting is to see these sort of pockets of support throughout the state, these kind of reddish to purplish areas. The president won towns in 2024 in Massachusetts he'd not won before.
Mhm.
I took a ride down to the South Coast. That's sort of the area of the state that's sandwiched between Rhode Island and Cape Cod. It's towns like Fall River and Acushnet. And these are fishing towns, New Bedford as well. Um, Portuguese immigrants who came from the Azores. They're really fascinating communities, and they had been solidly blue for a really long time, and are now going purplish to red. In fact, there's a special House election in the city of Taunton on Tuesday. Trump carried Taunton for the first time in 2024.
Mm.
Republicans took a state Senate seat there last November as well. And Republicans are looking to flip that House seat back to their column on Tuesday. It had been held by a Democrat for many years. So it is kind of like really the first real test um, whether the Trump effect we saw in November is going to carry over into legislative races and what that might portend for 26 and beyond. It's not going to affect the balance of the balance of power in the House one iota. Democrats have super majorities in the state House and Senate, but it's still a really fascinating kind of test case.
Right. And so far in special elections, Democrats have done quite well. I mean, a Democrat won, the mayoral election in Omaha, knocked out a Republican, but that was in the immediate aftermath of Trump's inauguration. So I know everybody is looking at every race down ballot to read the tea leaves for what's going to happen next year. Um, and so, I am kind of fascinated because you did go from Pennsylvania, which was the ultimate swing state. I mean, really, both Trump and Harris kind of put all their chips into it, and now you're in Massachusetts, and you're in a very vibrant city. But yeah, the perception is it's safely blue, so people maybe in politics don't spend as much time, looking at what's going on the ground. I'm wondering, are there more intra-party fights, in Massachusetts, because there is a supermajority?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of funny being in the presidential campaign last year, and people often talk about the Midwest being flyover country. Massachusetts was flyover country. I mean, I think we saw Harris and Trump, like I don't even think we saw Trump at all. We did see
Mm.
Harris, like, once, I think, and that was only for fundraisers. It wasn't for
Right.
sort of, like, large scale, rallies. The joke about that is that Massachusetts is kind of a Democratic ATM. Everyone comes in here to, and, cash out and then they leave. Tim Walz, I will say though, Tim Walz came in for a big rally in Boston in front of the firefighters who actually were kind of you might recall, were kind of on the bubble for the campaign there,
Right.
and to really get them on side. So we did see the VP candidate come in. But yeah, coming from Pennsylvania where they were in the country like every 15 minutes, it felt like in
Right.
20 and
Elon
22.
moved in.
Yeah. I mean, and my colleagues in my former colleagues there had more than had their hands full in 24. Um, I mean, it's been very interesting in Massachusetts, kind of learning the politics from the ground up here. And the one thing you learn, and I think you probably encountered this too, is just because you have super majorities, the Democrats control the House, they control the Senate, they control the executive branch, pretty much every level of government, does not mean that they agree all the time or that they see eye to eye on every issue. Just like every big family, everyone has their disagreements. And so you see that kind of traditional tension that you see in most state legislatures between the House and the Senate. Everyone has their prerogatives, and everyone guards those prerogatives quite jealously. We are in the midst of budget season right now here in Massachusetts, and this was again a learning experience for me. The governor presents her budget, the House
Mhm.
presents its budget, the Senate presents its budget, and then everyone votes, and then it bounces back and forth and it goes to conference committee and everyone tries to get agreement on a final spending bill, presumably before the clock ticks over from 12 a.m. on June 30th to 12:01 a.m. on July the 1st for the start of the new fiscal year.
Mhm.
They have not met that deadline in some years.
And I'm
And
sure it's more challenging this year when they have
yeah,
no idea what money is coming from the
I
feds.
mean, that's the added wrinkle. I mean, they're cautiously optimistic they might be able to get it over the goal line sometime in early July. But I mean, I talked with the Senate's chief budget writer a couple of weeks ago, and the Massachusetts state budget is premised on something like $16 billion in federal support. And all told, the state gets something like $23 billion in federal support. And they're plunging ahead, presuming that the money is going to be there when all is said and done, because that's really the only way you can proceed. But
Right.
it's a heck of a crapshoot, particularly when it comes to Mass Health, which is the big state health insurance program. It's Medicaid, as Medicaid is known here. So, of course, we have this drama unfolding on Capitol Hill right now with the big, beautiful bill with Medicaid cuts and other social safety net cuts on the
Right.
table. And everyone's kind of looking and saying, all right, what's going to happen there? Because they've said that if Medicaid is cut substantially in DC, that it's, quote, a total game changer here in Massachusetts, and that's gonna impact, I think Governor said, something like 200,000 beneficiaries, statewide,
And I would
so
imagine that would affect a lot of hospitals as well.
it's hospitals because then you have people coming into the ERs for care, and you start talking about uncompensated care and all of these sort of knock-on effects. So yeah, I mean, it's a very real, kind of conversation that budget writers here are watching quite carefully.
Right. And then, if the money does not come in, then you'll have to go back and cover as they have to slash everything. And I've had to do that. I've covered a couple state government shutdowns, and those are really fun sessions to cover.
Yeah, I mean, they do what are known as supplemental budgets here,
Right.
which is like, which I not see, which they didn't do in Pennsylvania. So it was again
Ah,
something I had to learn about. But they come in and they backfill that money. But there may well be the potential for them coming back in October, November, or even September to try to sort of. But I mean, they've made clear that they can't fully backfill all that because
right.
$16 billion is an incomprehensible amount of money. But they'll have to come back and try to address it on the back end somehow. So it's going to be, if that comes to pass, what that funding is going to look like, and then what kind of cuts may come to pass as well.
Right. And I know you were recently in Washington, and you cover Massachusetts senators. Elizabeth Warren obviously ran for president, and they're progressive favorites. But a lot of Democrats have been pretty frustrated by the leadership in the party since Trump took office again, especially folks like Chuck Schumer in the Senate. So, what kind of messaging have you seen from your senators in Massachusetts? Do you think it's been effective?
Yeah, so let me take this in two parts. So
Mhm.
Massachusetts Democrats did a statewide virtual listening tour after the 24 election. They did sessions all around the state, and I dropped into a couple of those. And sort of and this was immediately afterwards, so they were still in like the first or second stage of grief, whatever, like anger or denial or whatever it was. And the rage was palpable from these base Democratic voters. I went to a couple of town halls as well in various parts around the state for members of the congressional delegation. And you saw very much the same thing. We want you to stand up to the White House. We want you to be a bulwark against whatever the
Mhm.
Republican agenda is going to be. And you saw different messaging from different lawmakers. So in the instance of Elizabeth Warren, progressive icon, who, was then trying to save the CPFB as Musk was feeding it into the Doge. Um,
Right, the Consumers Protection Agency,
yeah, exactly,
essentially.
that she had found as Musk, pardon, was then funneling into kind of the Doge buzzsaw and shutting it down, striking a really defiant tone. And said, "I will fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them in the streets." And, very Churchill, and saying she would stop them and be a bulwark at every turn. Um, and then we'd see from a guy like Seth Moulton, who represents Up Salem Way, and your listeners probably
Mhm,
know about him because he made some remarks about transgender athletes that made
mhm.
national headlines, striking sort of more a middle ground. Yes, we need to be a bulwark. Yes, we need to be vigilant. But yes, we also need to get things passed because if we want to win in 26, we have to be able to point to stuff that we actually did to make people's lives better and not just having been Dr. No for the whole time. Because, yes, we need Democratic votes, but we need everybody else's votes too. So it kind of like this really interesting sort of continuum of messaging that we're seeing from Democratic politicians in this state. But I mean, what's been really striking, I think, is the change in tone from Governor Keeley, who I said at the beginning said, I will work with the White House where it is applicable, but we'll stick up for the state's values of tolerance and freedom and all that kind of stuff. Who has now struck a much more oppositional tone. Andrea Campbell, the state's elected attorney general, has now sued the White House. I don't know. I think she's like on her 16th lawsuit at this point, and has been at the vanguard of these Democratic state attorneys general, who've been suing the administration pretty consistently. So, I mean, so you've seen that kind of here as well. And that has been welcomed, obviously, by base voters and Democratic voters in the state.
Another big ongoing story that I know you've covered is Trump's attacks on Harvard. Most recently, the administration has been trying to block Harvard's ability to take students from overseas,
Mm.
but that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. For months, the administration has been at war with Harvard. They contend that they're too woke. They are too dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And basically, the administration wants the right to meddle in Harvard's affairs, to decide, that conservatives should have more of a place, in the university, and they can just get rid of certain programs that they don't want to have in place, even though Harvard is, its own entity. And traditionally, Republicans have not wanted the government to intervene in, the private sector or, in this case, nonprofit. So, most of us don't go to Harvard. Why why should people care about Trump's fight with an elite college?
Sure. Let me say first of all, I've mostly been of counsel, as they say, to this story. I want to give a shout out to our Juliet Schumann Hall, who has been working tirelessly on this story. And if your listeners and readers really want to know what's going on at Harvard, please follow Juliet's work because she's absolutely just been killing it. And I hope there's a vacation on a beach for her somewhere at the end of all of this. But I mean, I did actually write a column about this. Um, because you raise a fine point. Most of us are never going to go to a college with a $53 billion endowment, which is a number that kind of staggers the imagination. And, why do we need to care about a fight between the most powerful person in the world and a super elite university? And for Massachusetts residents, it really comes down to a couple of things. If your grandma is being treated for cancer and somebody at Harvard might be on the brink of the miracle cure, they will now, because they have a relationship with Massachusetts General Hospital, there's every possibility that those researchers may go someplace else and develop that cure someplace else. Harvard is an immense economic engine for the state's economy. It employs thousands of people. But then again, there's sort of the knock-on effects of all the businesses in Harvard Square that are around the university. There are the businesses that are around MGH and around Shan Medical School in Worcester. So, there's kind of these sort of like, I don't want to use the word trickle down, but it is. It's sort of like these trickle down economic effects because of all of the economic activity that Harvard generates. So, I mean, they're sort of two sort of really sort of I guess what unenlightened self-interest. I mean, there are two really self-interested reasons to care about this: the scientific research, the economic engine that Harvard is, and frankly, the tourism dollars that it draws to Massachusetts. And often, these students after graduation they stay,
Mhm.
so they then become taxpayers in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And what we're hearing is like a lot of these students now, they're like, I was going to stay, but I'm out, man. There's no reason for me to stay here. And, Juliet had a great story, the other day, like, the proximate cause of all of this was to combat anti-Semitism
Right.
at Harvard. This was supposed to be what this was intended to do way back, gosh, it's been a month or 2 now, but it feels like another lifetime, when they started this. And one of the sort of ironic effects of this is that by making it harder for international students to stay is that Israeli students who are studying at Harvard are now like, "Well, I gotta go home because you took away my visa and you're making it harder for me to stay here." So it's there's sort of been all these, like, unintended consequences, I guess, or stuff that maybe was not I don't wanna speak for the administration, but seems not thoroughly thought through in terms of sort of like the trickle down economic effects and what might become of, honestly, the Israeli and Jewish students that this was intended to help, I guess, at the outset. So, yeah.
Yeah. It tends to happen when you take a chainsaw to problems, there are going to be a lot of people impacted, by the splatter.
Yeah.
That was an awful metaphor, I apologize. But, I know that universities are huge economic drivers. We have the University of Michigan here, Michigan State, but, in Boston, I mean, it's like at a whole other level. In addition to Harvard, you've got in the area Wellesley and Boston College and Boston University and Tufts and on and on and on. And so, without those universities, in terms of just sheer direct, employment, but, these spin-off companies and the research, I can't imagine what Boston's economy would look like, and so,
Yeah,
it's
we're talking of into the billions of
right,
dollars in economic impact, yeah.
and even well beyond the state,
Mhm.
because if you develop a cure for cancer, at Harvard Medical School, obviously it will be used around the world. So,
Mhm.
and so you've got that huge impact on the economy, but also, there seems to be a huge issue with the independence of universities and academic freedom. Because if you can go after Harvard, which is a school everybody knows, then
Mhm.
I would assume that the administration would feel free to go and meddle with any college. Especially some of these smaller schools that do not have $60 billion in endowments.
Yeah, we saw that with Columbia, right? Columbus, tried to accommodate the, administration, and, yeah, it's sort of hard to overstate, um how much Massachusetts' identity is tied up with its higher education sector, particularly here in the greater Boston area. As you correctly point out, there are so many schools. You've got your Tufts, you got Wellesley, you got Brandeis. I mean, I can drive 20 minutes and hit 5 schools. And, we'd be remiss, of course, if we didn't talk about MIT, which also is this
Right.
great driver of innovation and exploration and science and knowledge and everything else. And that's again, you have students who go to MIT and they graduate and then they stay and they start a software firm or they start a robotics firm or an AI firm or whatever. And so there is this kind of like knock-on effect where the students who might have stayed are now going to leave. And that affects sort of not only medical research, Susan, but sort of innovation more broadly, because you have all of this quite frankly, fascinating stuff coming out that I don't pretend to understand because I'm not a science guy, but coming out of MIT. And our Scott Kersner, who writes about innovation, is talk hours about this, but, he's really explained sort of the implications for Massachusetts and its economy if this stuff starts to go away. Um, and yeah, so I'm sorry. Anyway, so that's that.
It seems to me that another aspect of this fight is that Trump has always had a chip on his shoulder, because so many elites regarded him as a vulgar showman from Queens. I mean, yes, he went to Penn, but and that's an Ivy, but as anyone who goes to Harvard will tell you, it's not Harvard. And that seems to have really gotten under his skin. And so, his campaigns have centered on, draining the swamp and sticking it to elites, even though he's obviously his agenda has given tax breaks and every advantage to billionaires. But, how much of this resentment and this grievance, seems to be the undercurrent in the reason why Trump picked Harvard to go after
I
so
can't
so vocally?
I don't pretend to have any insight into the president's psyche, but I think what I will say is that Harvard feels like a test case
Mhm,
in a lot of ways. We have heard a lot about how the president has looked to overseas leaders like Viktor Orban, who brought the media and higher education to heel in Hungary as he sort of consolidated his grip on power. And it does feel in some ways, and if you talk to people here, it does feel like Harvard is that test case. If they can bring an elite institution like Harvard to heel,
mhm,
then that is proof of concept that they can do it. And we saw Columbia settle, as we said a moment ago, but that is proof of concept that they can do it elsewhere as well. And Harvard is pushing back mightily against this at tremendous cost to universities. Juliet has another great story today about university professors who are now opting not to teach certain courses as a consequence, or are who are shutting down or who are leaving the country entirely.
mhm,
Um, I have to throw a shout out to my colleagues at WGBH FM, the NPR, one of the two NPR affiliates in Boston. We are lucky enough to have two in the city, but they announced some layoffs yesterday that were directly tied to cuts in federal funding. So we're sort of seeing this. It's not, it's, I don't want to use the term silent, but we're seeing it in various iterations um, across the state. And again, it feels like proof of concept. If they can
right.
do it here, then they can move that model elsewhere as well.
Right. And of course, NPR is suing the Trump administration,
Yes.
that over those cuts. And that's a
Exactly.
case that we'll all be watching very closely. Um, and I did want to talk a little bit about media coverage of Trump because I've seen really fantastic work at the state level. A lot of outlets across the country are doing great work talking about the impact of what this budget bill might be and these ICE raids. But in Washington, I'm wondering, do you feel like there's a different tone to coverage than there was the first time around? Is there more of an emphasis on access journalism, or is it about the same?
Well, I mean, obviously every member of our delegation here is Democratic, so it's we're not running the city in issues in swing states where our colleagues have had issues trying to get to Republican lawmakers.
Hmm.
They're more than happy to talk because it all goes to their benefit. But I mean, I can only speak for Mass Lab. I won't presume to speak for anybody else. But what we've really tried to do in a very real way um, is explain the implications of what the mega bill will do, what that will mean for residents here, to really go deep on what the situation at Harvard means in a real ground level kind of way. The impact that these ICE arrests are having on individual communities and school districts and families. We're really trying to keep it focused on explanatory journalism, so the downstream impacts, and what it means from a very Massachusetts prism.
And I really feel like that's journalism at its best. It's supposed to be about, giving you information that is useful to your lives. I've always admired the work that you've done in
Thank you.
Pennsylvania and now here.
Thanks.
And so thank you so much for being with us. And I appreciate everybody tuning in. this morning. Please to the next week, and I will be talking with other of our colleagues from around the country about what they're covering. But John, thank you. I really hope that you'll come back and see us because it's just so great to have your insights about what's going on in Boston.
Happy to. Give me a call anytime. Susan, always lovely to see you. Thank you.
Great,
And
thank
thanks
you.
for everybody else. Everybody too. Thanks for watching.